You've just entered Philberts Forum, where we peel the onion back and take a lighter look at the workplace.
All right, so here's the first one here. This is my attempt at conflict resolution. Although, I never recommend screaming and yelling in the workplace, Tanya, but sometimes that direct approach might be preferable to the next one that we might see here. Why don't we switch to the next one, Nick, and we'll let Tanya comment on this one.
Well, for the audio listeners, we should say that is Xena. I believe it's Xena, the Princess Warrior, and she's got a very angry face. Okay.
In a full battle cry from Xena.
Yeah.
So what about this one, Tanya? What are your thoughts here?
Well, it's funny because comparing the two, yelling and screaming versus just avoidance, I think in the workplace we see avoidance so much more often. And, I've referenced Brene Brown on the show before, but, one of the things that she talks about in her workplace is clear is kind. And so both ends of this, maybe we're not being kind, right? If we're yelling and screaming and we're acting out of straight emotion, that's not very kind, nor is it clear. And if you're avoiding, also, again, you're not being clear. So I think that's what we're going to talk about today is how do you resolve conflict in a way that it doesn't have to have a bad connotation. Conflict isn't bad. It's how we deal with it and approach it that leads to problems.
Well, and I think that's a really good point there because, like you said, conflict in and of itself is not bad. That's a lot of times how really good decisions get made is because there's conflict. And conflict, if it's done properly, really should result in good analysis. And so I think that's a really important piece that seems to be missing sometimes from the workplace these days is that people are so focused on either their own position and they're dug in and they're screaming and yelling, or they just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to have that conflict. And as a result, we sort of miss out on opportunities for good analysis. All right, let's take a look at one last one here. And maybe this is what we need more of, Tanya.
Well, we also need to let those audio listeners know that this was a picture. I think it's a Hemsworth brother, and he's not making eye contact with anyone. And I would say it'd be hard to not make eye contact with a Hemsworth brother. Am I right? Here we go. Next.
All right. The last one here shows people, adult in the workplace with suits on, playing rock, paper, scissors. Let's resolve this like mature adults would. But at least that's a conflict that may be taking place, but there's a resolution method and nobody's yelling at each other and nobody's avoiding each other. So I think this does represent sort of that compromise that Tanya was talking about there. So, all right, well, let's move on from that. Let's head over to the Employers Lounge. And Tanya, we're going to talk to you before we get into the subject here. Let's take a quick look at our poll results. And so which triggers have led to conflict in your workplace this year? The number one response here, wow, we really got a lot of participation today, which is great, is personality clashes. 22% of the respondents said personality clashes are probably the number one source of conflict in the workplace. And I think that's right on this poll because personality clashes is a really broad term that encompasses some of the other items that we saw in the poll. The next one at 20% is communication issues. And interestingly, everything got some sort of response. Interestingly, though, the last two, compensation and benefits and discrimination and harassment, both around 4%. I think that's a good sign that harassment and discrimination is that low. But that just shows we have a lot to do, though, with respect to managing personality conflict in the workplace. Tanya, what are your thoughts on this first poll here?
So I can't believe the results of this poll because I think it's so in line with really what we recommend when we come in and work with organizations. The very first thing that I always do is I start with everyone taking a personality test. And if you've done any research in that, there's, if you look at Myers-Briggs, you look at that, there's about 16 personality classifications. And no 16 is superior to any of the others, right? So when we look at that, there are differences in personality. And so building up our awareness of that so that we understand, hey, this is just a different approach. and not make it personal to that individual. It's just default behavior. So how can we become more flexible in our default? And then, of course, communication issues. And then organizational change is really a communication issue, right? The right people weren't involved in that decision, or we haven't communicated it. So I think this is very much in line with what I'm seeing, and also how we attack the problem when we go in and try to address conflict issues in the workplace.
Very good. Well, let's take a look at the word cloud, Nick. What did we get on the word cloud, our PG rated word cloud? So, all right. Someone took my hyphenated advice in there, and another person just ran it all together. Banana ice cream there, but yeah, some of the favorites here are grievance, banana ice cream, rhino, no, layoff, 100% in office work, politics. I have a feeling the person who put rhino in politics might have been the same person. And then incompetent was another one that showed up in the word cloud. So very interesting results there. Well, with that, let's talk about some specific questions. We've done a really good job, or Tanya, you've done a really good job of sort of bringing into the discussion throughout some of the ideas around workplace conflict. What trends are you noticing in workplace conflict these days?
I'm noticing it's on the rise. I'm just talking to people about it more, and I'm seeing it throughout all levels of the organization. People are reaching out to say, we have a problem, and I don't exactly know what it is. And we start to break it down. It's that they're getting stuck. And so if your workplace has pockets where you don't feel like you're making forward progress, or you keep trying to solve the same thing over and over, it's very, very likely that conflict, as odd as that seems, is getting in the way. And I think the reason for that is we don't get a manual of, hey, this is how to engage in conflict. And depending on what factors are at play, sometimes we don't want to create conflict at all in the workplace because that's our job. And we don't want to do anything that could, impact our livelihood. On the other end, sometimes we are just conditioned out in the real world that we bring all that real world conflict strategy into when we have conversations at work. And that's getting in the way as well. So from both ends, I'm just seeing a lot out there that companies, organizations, and individuals are getting hung up and not being as productive as they need to be, really because of conflict.
So what's the research? What's the research really showing as the cause for this conflict that's out there?
So I think there's lots of different things that are there. But when I look at problem solving it and I think about group dynamics, that's where I go to solve it. Because I read an article a while ago, and it was in Forbes, and they were looking at what makes entrepreneurial teams successful. And one of the key indicators that they had in terms of success or not is, have they all worked together before? And that seems like a no-brainer, but when you break down the social science behind that, it's because they've already formed as a team. And Nick, I've got a slide that's very rudimentary, but it's this idea that came out in project management. This is back from in the 1960s, and they studied and said, what makes teams successful? What do you need to make them successful? And they went through these 4 stages: forming, storming, norming, and performing. And just for our listeners, this is kind of like a curve that starts out high and then it dips down and then it goes up. And the idea is when a team first comes together and they're forming, everybody's really in ego, if I can, play this just a little bit, right? I'm here to prove myself. I want to make sure that I'm making a good impression. I'm doing all of those things. And then when it gets to but every team, when you come together, you have to have that storming phase so that you can get real, right? If you have read anything from the Table Group, the 5 dysfunctions of a team, that's fundamental. We have to have trust. And to get to trust, we have to have vulnerability. Well, if we don't get out of that ego of I have to always be right, then we don't get there. And so what I come in and I see a lot of organizations do is they're stuck at the bottom of storming. We're not coming to conclusions in meetings. We're not being able to communicate that. My favorite, where I always know there's dysfunction, is I say, how many meetings after the meeting do you have, right? Everybody breaks off in their small groups and they're walking down the hallway having the meeting after the meeting. And that's really what we're seeing. And so to me, when I look at the science behind it, teams that are highly functional have figured out how to have conflict. So they're not storming, they're just raising issues. And I think that's a key thing to success in the workplace.
So very interesting, and I appreciate the comments there. And I think that that really does illustrate the importance of trying to manage relationships in the workplace. Tanya, do you have suggestions on actions that employers can take to help in this respect?
Yeah, absolutely. And doing a little research, it's there. A quick Google search, Newsweek is reporting on this. A lot of people are reporting on really the impact and the cost that to organizations with not being able to handle conflict. And first and foremost, it's where I'm going to start always. You guys hear me say this all the time. What are your values in your organization, right? Get really clear on how we handle conflict. Do we have communication channels where people disagree? Do we have a culture where we have leadership that are modeling this idea of good, healthy conflict? So start there. Know your values and know how to onboard your employees so they know how to function in the workplace. The second is have clear expectations, right? Because a lot of times what gets in the way is we think something's my job and someone's stepping on my toes, or we think it's somebody else's job and it's impacting me. So how do we get clear on expectations? And then finally, we need to give leaders and employees some skills. How do we have difficult conversations? How do we demonstrate the benefits of conflict? Not all can be accomplished through training, but I think it starts as clarity of why this is important and leaders really modeling that behavior.
Thank you once again for tuning in to This Week at Work. If you enjoy the show, please share it with your colleagues. Forward our invites. Share the link aimea.org/thisweekatwork, or follow or subscribe wherever you get your news and entertainment, like LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're everywhere you are. And you can be part of the show. Send your questions and comments anytime to info@thisweek.work. We'll see you next week, 7:30 a.m. Central Time, when we discuss what's happening this week at work.